Homosexuality. What is it? The dictionary definition is the sexual desire or behavior directed towards people of one's own sex or gender. It is a state of being sexually attracted only to people of one's own sex or gender. Dictionary.com. How is this degenerate, you may ask? What's so wrong about loving another person? Well, I can give you a very short and concise answer as a Christian, that being many Bible quotes from both the Old and New Testaments. Here are some notable examples. Leviticus 18:22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination. Leviticus 20:13. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. Yes, this is from the Old Testament, but the original intention of God's will stands in later verses. Romans 1:26 through 27. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Of course, I believe God gave us certain things just to be for a man and a woman. I could go on, and I will later, but for those of you who are not Christian, or you are Christian and you're just looking for an in-depth look onto the degeneracies of homosexuality and how we got here in the first place, from more secular or more recent perspective than just, oh, the Bible says so. Of course, I believe what to be said in the Bible is true, but we can break down the logic and reasonings behind these verses without actually looking at biblical text, but instead using history and logic. If that interests you, then this video is for you. To first understand why it's degenerate, we must first understand how we got to the point we are today. The point where every June, sexual deviants parade across the street, shoving their twisted desires in the faces of everybody that surrounds them. The point where men dress and act as women and think they are women, and we're supposed to just go along with it and say nothing? Breathing life into their little fantasies? To say nothing otherwise can get you locked up for hate crimes, depending on where you live. Even though in reality, we all know it's a mental illness. I'm getting ahead of myself. History! FYI, I'm going to be condensing and simplifying some of this, but anyway. You know, at first when I was younger, I thought homosexuality was something new. Unfortunately, it's not. It's just ramped up in the past 50 years. You know, the first recorded homosexual couple can be traced back to ancient Egyptian times. Khnum-Hotep and Niam-Khtum. Khnum? I bet you I'm butchering those names, but anyway, on their tomb it said they would lay with mankind as they would womankind. From what we know, this would happen rarely in the ancient world, and from there we see it in places like the Greek city-states. You know, Sparta famously having homosexual soldiers. They thought fighting alongside their lovers would be better for battle. One fascinating aspect of the Greek city-states is the closer they were to civilizational collapse, or the Roman conquests, their laws on sexual behavior, child predation, and similar laws would lessen and lessen over time. By the time Rome conquered the Greek city-states, many parts of ancient Greece, especially places like classical Athens, had a culturally sanctioned practice known as pederasty, a relationship between an adult man, the erastes, and a younger adolescent boy, the eronymos. The Romans found the Greek style of pederasty distasteful, especially involving freeborn boys. They believe it weakened manhood and blurred social hierarchies. Roman writers, Cicero and Livy, often accused the Greeks of being decadent, especially in their sexuality. This is one of the many reasons to justify the conquest against the Greeks. But I just find it fascinating that when the Greeks let homosexuality run rampant, it led to the predation of children and the inevitable conquest of their civilization. Sounds familiar, huh? And of course, when the Romans took over, they had laws preventing predation of children of freeborn men. I guess slaves were still free game. But in Rome, it was looked down upon, so instances were rare, and just because it was involving slaves, no real laws were ever made. Against slave predation, that is. With things like the Lex Julia de Adulteres, it was a law that Augustus Caesar tried to make. Well, He didn't make it, and it created things like better familial structure, and it outlawed adultery before Rome was even Christian. Of course, in the 4th century AD, under Christian Roman emperors like Constantine and especially Theodosius, Roman law began explicitly criminalizing same-sex relations, especially involving boys or adolescents. Laws were passed condemning same-sex acts, sometimes with severe penalties, even death. The Christians' worldview treated these acts as sinful and abomination, much more harshly than pagan Roman tradition had beforehand. But my point here being is that this is the first time we see an openly homosexual society crumble, letting its moral rot and decay eventually lead to a Roman victory against them. Guess what? This inevitably happened to the Romans too. There are many reasons for why the Romans fell, external barbarian, corruptions of the elite, slave labor, and foreigners outnumbering the Romans 10 to 1. But what happens again and again, in the western part of the empire at least, their laws on child predation and homosexuality began to become ignored. Even with the Catholic Church in place, there was a split between the empire and the church. Many Roman Christian writers, e.g. Sylvian and Marcellet, condemned the moral decay of the cities, particularly sexual excess, child prostitution, and abuse, just like in Greece. When the Romans let their moral structure fall apart, their whole civilization crumbled. Anyway, this is just a fascinating pattern you begin to see with the collapse of civilization and homosexuality. Moving forward in time, we get to the medieval times. You don't see too much homosexuality. All religions in the civilized Know world disliked homosexuality. So even if you are naturally homosexual, you want to express it. Even if you look at tribal America, it wasn't there either. And for those of you that don't know what two-spirited is, it's like a thing that the Native Americans had where they believed that there was a male and female spirit in them. It was just like feminine men back in the tribal times. But there is actually no proof of this ever existing, in fact. The term was made up by Elder Myra Larame in the 1990s at like a gay pride meeting in Canada. I only bring it up because people will talk about it when mentioning homosexuality in tribal times. Anyway, the influence religion has on homosexuality gets loosened a bit by science explaining things over time from the Renaissance to modern day, and the rise of atheism and whatnot, which is also something that would be good. That would be a good video, yeah. Anyway, as much as I would love to go over the history of the world, another video idea, not much has happened with homosexuals for hundreds of years. Like there's that big gap from medieval times to like the 1800s. Within that gap, it was morally shunned, punishable by death, depending on the region. But once again, it was disliked. Of course, there was homosexual poets and writers every now and then, and yes, their rights and quality of life improved in the 19th, 20th, and drastically in the 21st centuries, as well as prominent figures being homosexual. But here's the thing. The overall amount of homosexuals in the world remained a 0.1 and at most a 0.2% of the world population. And it stays super low for all of history until this one decade. The 1960s. Yes, I'm skipping a lot of world history, but it doesn't relate to the point. We're skipping to the 1960s because, nothing ever happens until now. The 1960s. America just got done with its golden decades, the 1950s, the baby boom, conservatism galore, winning a world war just 15 years earlier. Sure, the Soviets had been annoying us, but it was nothing like what's to come. With people looking ahead, hoping that things are just going to keep getting better and better. But this decade wouldn't be like the last. No. Within this decade, many things would occur. Many things that were made or legalized that would change society forever. Birth control, condoms, and later abortion. All of this, along with another wave of feminism, would create the conditions that would spiral into what we see today. With all these things coming into society, it made, the dirty have all the benefits and pleasures with none of the downsides. Women no longer worried about accidentally having kids, not to the extent it was, and even if they did and, accidentally became pregnant, they could just kill the kid whenever they pleased. I could dive into how abortion is bad for society, killing its own population and whatnot, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Another video idea, I guess. Men could go out and do the deed whenever they pleased. This created what was known as the sexual revolution, a time where everybody was getting freaky. I could go into more detail. I won't. Long story short, this ended up having really bad overall repercussions. An interesting thing that begins to happen when people begin to freak more is that the number of people identifying as homosexual starts to increase. Huh. That's weird. I wonder why that is. It goes from 0.1% to 2%. Almost as if a hypersexualized society where people are getting freaky all the time and sexual things start becoming more commonplace in everyday life breeds more unnatural behavior in people. But I can hear you saying, well, they're just expressing themselves in a free country. Well, I guess to a certain extent you could argue that, since you wouldn't be getting the death penalty because homosexual and that the numbers would increase. And to a certain point, I'd have to agree. But it's those numbers going from 0.1% to 1%. Keep in mind, this is relative to America's overall population. Even though it looks like a small increase, it's not. The difference between 0.1% and 1%, let's just use modern U.S. population, for example. 0.1% of the USA is 331,000 people, while 1% of the U.S. population is 3.31 million people. Let's just play around with the liberal line of thinking that the number increases over time because people can be free. Okay, well then this number goes from 0.1 throughout all of history, grows to 2% in the 1960s, and continues to steadily grow and grow. Gay marriage is legalized, 7.6%, and then you get to modern day, where 9.6% of adults identify as homosexual or LGBTQ+. That is 1 out of every 10 people you see. Guess what else? It's not like it's proportional based off generations either. This number is what convinced me to make this video. That number being 33% of Gen Z identify as homosexuals! That is 1 out of every 3 people in Gen Z that identify as homosexual, or any of the numbers and letters under the beacon of LGBTQ. Compare this to the boomers, and only 4% of them consider themselves homosexual. This relates to the US, of course. It must be way worse in Western Europe. Hey, this is editing me here. It is. It really is. Now, this brings me to the whole reason I made this little history part of my video to begin with, which is to prove my point that homosexuality is a social contagion. Now, for those of you who don't know, a social contagion is the spread of behaviors, emotion, and ideas through a group, often unconsciously, through processes like imitation and conformity. Simplified, it is a way ideas spread. Now, why do I call homosexuality a social contagion? Well, with the numbers I've just shown, I think it's clear that this isn't just people being quote-unquote free and expressing themselves. No. This is something that is way deeper, something built on the fabric of our very culture and society. Take a look at the East. China, Russia, these countries still have a 0.1 homosexuality rates, but they still pop up. Plus, in those countries, you don't die if you're a homosexual, so you can't use that argument. The numbers have only gone up in the West. So, what's happened? How did these numbers increase? What happened was the glorification of homosexuality in the West. Now, what do I mean by glorification? I mean that throughout the West in recent time, being homosexuality has been seen as a good thing. In cities like New York, LA, Chicago, Minneapolis, really any liberal city, when you come out as gay, you're applauded into being, oh my God, you're so unique, brave enough to stand up to those bigots. Hell, for a time, you were given benefits for being gay. You were more likely to get into college. If you were some one-legged black trans person, all of a sudden, you can get to any college you wanted because of DEI and other retarded policies like that. Also, the whole trans ideology is a complete mental illness, propped up by everyone having to go along pretending to help with their little fantasies. Unlike basic homosexuality, same-sex relations, not all the extra numbers and letters that have slowly been gained by the LGBTQIA plus whatever the hell they're adding nowadays. Like, seriously, you know what? Let me just look it up. How many genders are there? How many genders are there? What? 72? What the fuck? Anyway, as I was saying, trans ideology is the new thing. There's never actually been a time in history when men actually thought they were women and women actually thought they were men. Sure, some men acted more feminine and women acted more masculine, but we had terms for those. If you were a woman who acted like a guy, you were a tomboy. And if you were a man who acted like a woman, you were a femboy. Of course, different meanings nowadays, but no one ever actually thought they were a different gender. They just acted differently. Even like the ladyboys in Thailand who dress like women, but don't actually think they're women. That's the thing that's different about the West and the East. The people in the West genuinely think that they're a different gender. That's delusional. Let me give you a scenario. If my grandpa is a schizophrenic and he watches TV and he actually thinks that the guy on the TV is just talking to him, no one else, and he talks back to the guy on the TV, like the TV broadcaster, and my grandpa thinks that the TV broadcaster can hear him, what's the better thing to do? Do I go along with the delusion and tell my schizo-mentally ill grandpa, oh yeah, grandpa, he is, and then I walk away just ignoring the problem entirely? Or do I go up to him and say, oh, no, grandpa, the guy on the TV isn't just talking to you, he can't hear you. Let me go get your meds. That's the same thing with transgenderism. What's better, to confirm the delusion or to tell them what's real? And guess what? Back in the day, we used to tell them what was real. But when a society gets hypersexualized, things become more and more normalized. Next thing you know, your kid wants to be called Rex and has the pronouns of Zer. All of this has led me to two conclusions. The first of which being that homosexuality is a social contagion. The second being that original homosexuals are genetic defects. How did I come to that conclusion? Well, think about it. How is it that homosexuality keeps coming up again randomly all throughout the world, all throughout history even? That's because it's a genetic defect, just like autism or colorblindness. But the thing is, the gene usually never gets passed down, as homosexuals don't have kids. I mean, they got the parts to, they just don't. Though the mainstream media says, oh, there is no gay gene, studies have been done stating that there is. It's just a collection of genes that lead to homosexuality in the first place, not just one single gene. So what we see consistently all throughout the time is these minuscule amount of people just being homosexual. And it stayed that way until the 1960s, or in certain places like Athens, the number increased as the genetic defect homosexuals influencing and coercing others around them into being homosexual. We saw it in Athens, and we're seeing it again today, where it becomes something cultural. And we see today drag queen story time, homosexual sex ed being taught to elementary schoolers. Whenever a gay couple adopts kids, they end up becoming LGBTQ plus 96% of the time. Legalization of same-sex marriages, an inherent religious ceremony. The transgender delusion that has been normalized, pedophiles being more likely to be homosexual, and when they do their sex crimes, most of the time their victim either is forever sexually repressed or they themselves becoming homosexual. With all of this information, I hope that I have proven to you that homosexuality started naturally as a genetic defect and happens in humans randomly like all genetic defects, but depending on the culture and how free homosexuals are allowed to express their attraction, I have showed you how much it has spread and what happens when it is left unchecked. Now, going back to the question I asked way earlier, why is homosexuality degenerate? Before we continue, let me define to you what a degenerate is. Having lost the physical, mental, or moral qualities considered to be normal and desirable, showing evidence of decline. A more technical term is lacking some property, order, or distinctness of structure previously or usually present. Oxford Languages. A degenerate, by definition, is someone who lacks normality, and not the kind of normality that makes you unique. It's not individuality. It can be a lack of morals or a lack of mental stability. You name it. Originally, my first point was going to be that homosexuality is degenerate because it's not natural. This is a common mistake made when discussing the degeneracies of homosexuality, of course, because with the history I've shown you, I hope you understand that To a very small certain extent, it is natural. But that's just the thing. It's a small percentage. It's not that natural. A couple 0.1 percentage points here or there, but the length today we have it is crazy. Something I was getting at is, yes, a certain number of people are homosexual, but the thing that has been going on since the 1960s is how homosexuality has spread. That's not natural. It's not natural for a society consisting of straight heterosexual people that need to reproduce to keep their society growing and have it go from that to a bunch of people that like taking it up the ass. In theory, it shouldn't be able to spread, but yet it does. That's what's not natural. When I was younger, I thought that all homosexuals would eventually just die off because they don't reproduce. But yet, time and time again, we see them pop up all throughout history. And it grows, and it grows, and something is done to protect the culture. In my earlier points, I hope I described to you and convinced you that there is a homosexual gene or strands of genes that cause homosexual behavior in the first place. If not, how the hell does it even start? Thus, homosexuality is degenerate because of the things homosexuals do to undermine society. They cause fewer people to be born into a nation. They make being homosexual their entire identity, coercing the culture. They convert others into becoming homosexual by experimenting. Even children aren't spared from them. Because a degenerate lacks qualities to be normal or desirable, all of which characteristics I've just described that fall under that category, it is because of these reasons homosexuals are degenerate. Now, after watching through this entire video and going through history of how we got here and how homosexuality is degenerate, what comes next? Sure, you have a better understanding of what happens when a right-wing talking point comes up of, oh, homosexuals are degenerate. But what now? What do we do to solve this problem? That's just a thing. It can't be solved. As history has proven, there will always be homosexuals. A very, very small number of them. The only way to change it entirely would be to be able to genetically edit a human gene, which we haven't been able to do yet. Or if we can, we haven't been publicly allowed to yet. But God only knows how long till we get that technology. And even then, the gay gene won't be the top priority. It'll be getting rid of autism, retardation, other bad inheritable genes from the genetic code. Thus, today, the only thing we can do is protect our culture, our schools, our children and future generations from being converted into homosexuality. Hello! I am the right-wing Lutheran. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe. I put a lot of effort into these videos, and this is my longest one thus far. If you have anything to say, leave it in the comments, or if you have any video suggestion, leave it in the comments. Kind of starting this whole thing off, and I would love to see your support. Anyway, thank you for watching.